Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we are continuing our series on Luther. We saw in the last episode at the Second Leipzig Disputation, Martin Luther refusing to allow Johann Eck to enter Second Maccabees into debate to serve as proof. Why? Because it is not canonical. So that's been the whole point of this series, and we've shown how Calvin's myth that the Council of Trent had raised these books to unseen authoritative heights that they never before possessed, that Luther was actually using these books in the same way as Trent, all the way up to Leipzig, where he flip flops and then denies Second Maccabees canonical status and the ability to confirm doctrine. Is that his final position on this? Well, this episode, we're going to find something very surprising, and I think you're all going to enjoy it. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. Okay, so Martin Luther and July 8th, 1519, Second Leipzig Disputation, says, quote, "There is no proof of purgatory in any portion of sacred scripture which can be entered into argument and serve as proof. The Book of Maccabees, not being in the canon, is of weight with the faithful, but avails nothing with the obstinate." And that has been our touchstone for our series because we've gone over all the previous disputes, disputations, theses, everything we could find that Luther had written prior to 1519. And we've seen how Luther is thoroughly Augustinian on the canon. He accepts the Deuterocanon as fully canonical scripture. He adduces them in theological disputes to serve as proof. And even on occasion, he appears to have used it completely in a canonical sense until 1519, where Luther makes that denial. And he, when he's pressed by Johann Eck on this point, appeals to St. Jerome. And we've looked at that in the last video. If you haven't seen that video, stop right now, watch the previous video so you can get up to speed. And in fact, Eck had appealed to the Ecumenical Council of Florence, the Great Union Council that met a couple centuries earlier, and he showed how, the Council Fathers used Second Maccabees in their deliberations. They also even promulgated a canon in the decree on the Jacobites, and the Second Maccabees was part of that canon. Luther's response was that Eck has to first undermine or undercut or refute St. Jerome before he would consider Florence. And by doing that, he not only rejected Second Maccabees, but the whole of the Deuterocanon, because as you know, St. Jerome in his prophecies had rejected the whole Deuterocanon, all 7 books, as apocrypha, and they're used for edification, but they cannot be used to confirm doctrine. So the question is that where Luther rests? Is that his final position on the canon? So this is July 8th, 1519. Well, you know what? Surprisingly, it doesn't appear so, because I, in a recent academic level article that, by the way, is available on Patreon if you want to support us, from debates after Leipzig, we find some very surprising information. In fact, beginning with the resolutions of the Second Leipzig Disputation. So, in the very resolutions of the debate in which he rejects Second Maccabees and appeals to St. Jerome, in those very resolutions, we find this. So, we're going to be looking at the resolutions to the propositions debated at Leipzig. This was penned by Luther in August 1519. So, disputation was in July. Very next month, he pens this resolution. And does he reinforce or apply what he used against Eck in the disputation in his arguments in the resolutions? Surprisingly, no, he does not. And so in the resolutions, the propositions debated at Leipzig, and in this video, I'm just going to refer to it simply as the resolutions because that's going to get really tedious really quick. Luther continues to deduce and adduce, I should say, deuterocanonical texts in debate, despite what he says in Leipzig a month earlier. Yeah, surprising enough, the first instance occurs in the first conclusion in the resolutions. Now, there is no translation of the resolutions, just like I have been unable to find a complete translation of the Leipzig disputation. So this is my own English translation of the Latin, and I'll provide the Latin for you right here underneath. And he writes, quote, "Nor will I fear even the very envy which heretical patrons may accuse me of, because I know that there is no trade for truth with envy. As wisdom says, quote, neither will I go with consuming envy, for such a man shall not be partaker of wisdom," unquote. And by the way, as far as the Book of Wisdom is concerned, our relationship with God is a participation in the divine wisdom. Okay. So by saying partaking of this consuming envy actually does not allow you to partake of divine wisdom. And therefore, it's really a salvation issue. But that aside, notice here, Luther is adducing the Book of Wisdom, which in a month earlier, he said couldn't be done because you could only use text to serve as proof that were of canonical status. And of course, wisdom was rejected along with all the other books with St. Jerome. So we find a flip flop. So we have an unqualified quotation of Wisdom 6:25. And Luther acknowledges that one who partakes of consuming envy will not partake of the wisdom of God. And this is based on a deuterocanonical text. Very odd, right? If that weren't enough, there's another instance in the first conclusion of part 5, or excuse me, point 5, in which he writes, quote, "But faith alone firmly trusts that it pleases God. And it is by this faith that we please God, because this faith truly feels good about God and truly has him as God, presuming good things about him. According to that wisdom, chapter 1, quote, think of the Lord in goodness, unquote. For it is impossible for a man to be saved and to live well unless he feels good about God towards himself, unquote." All right, so here we have Martin Luther making a formal quotation from the Book of Wisdom. And I think this is actually a very important proof text for him. Luther's thought is that faith alone pleases God, and because in it we truly feel good about God, presuming good things about him, Luther then nails down his thought with a brief quotation from Wisdom 1:1. And then he concludes that unless one, quote, feels good about God, unquote, because of faith alone, it is impossible for one to be saved. So here, Wisdom 1:1 functions almost like a middle term that's shared between the opening premise and the conclusion. In other words, he's clearly understands wisdom to be capable of bearing theological weight necessary to establish doctrinal points. The very same thing he denies 1 month earlier at Leipzig. So Leipzig does not seem to be a watershed moment. In fact, it seems to be a kind of odd moment given the resolutions. If that weren't enough, he then quotes again from the Deuterocanon in the first inclusion, point 6, in which he says, quote, "Behold, No one requires God, and all decline. No one understands God, let alone has God as the end in his work. Hence, he, that's St. Paul, confidently concludes by saying, quote, God has concluded all under sin, unquote, Galatians 3:22. And then he writes, behold, we receive no one, all under sin, as David also says, every man is a liar, quoting Psalm 116. But what is truth to be told from a liar? What shall become clean from the unclean, says wisdom. And that's actually a quote from Sirach 34:4. Again, we have a deuterocanonical text. In this case, now it's the book of Sirach, one of the deuterocanonical books, being used by Luther to establish a doctrinal point. And notice how he cites Sirach along with quotations from Galatians and Psalms. He makes no distinction, no qualification in regards to their respective authority. In all appearances, Sirach is on the same authoritative level as Psalms and Galatians. Now, what's interesting is if this were the only access that we had to the Second Leipzig Disputation, we would have every reason to believe that Luther is continuing to be Augustinian on the canon like we've seen in all the previous disputations. Here he's adducing wisdom and also Sirach in debate to serve as proof, and he's using it to substantiate some pretty heavy theological points. So there's no indication that Luther has applied what he brought up at Leipzig just a month earlier. All right, so if that weren't fascinating enough, maybe it just took a little time for his appeal to St. Jerome to grab a hold of him and him to become consistent. Well, let's look at yet another disputation. This one is called, and it has a rather lengthy title, A Defense of Martin Luther Against the Malicious Judgment of Johann Eck over several articles attributed to him by certain brothers. And this was published on September 30th, 1519. So again, this is after Second Leipzig Disputation. And we'll just call this the defense just for short. And this will be the last text that we're going to look in this series on Luther. This rather caustic treatise reflects Luther's ongoing polemic with Johann Eck, his opponent at Leipzig. It was published in September 30th, 1519. In it, Luther repeats the same text that he uses in the introduction declaration that we saw in his reply to Prierius. Now, if you recall, that was an important disputation between the chief censor at Rome and in which Luther responds with another caustic letter. And if you recall, he makes a formal declaration of the presuppositions and methodology he's going to use in that dispute. And in that, he quotes from St. Augustine that he's going to give honor alone to the books that are called canonical, and he believes that none of them err. Okay. Here he also alludes to that in the same disputation with Eck, although it's not a formal declaration like we find with reply to Prierius, but it does show that he is thinking in terms of sola scriptura and thinking in terms of canonical scriptures alone having the appropriate authoritative weight in debate. Okay, so in Article 9 of this uh, explanation or defense, Luther is talking about free will. He says, concerning man not having free will, Luther corrects Eck on his use of Sirach 15:14 and following in referring to free will existing in paradise before the fall. So here's the quote, and it says, quote, Eck well knows that it is impious, and yet he does not instruct the brethren. but cooperates most impiously in their error. I say then that man has free will, not because he is just as he was in paradise, of which Ecclesiasticus 15, that's Sirach 15, speaks of being introduced by Ek, but because he was free and can become free again through grace. Otherwise, it is truly a slave's will, unquote. So Eck had adduced Sirach 15 as a proof for free will. Notice Martin Luther does not respond to him like he did at Second Leipzig. He doesn't say, Johann, you cannot adduce Sirach into debate to serve as proof because it's not in the canon. He doesn't do that. Instead, what he does is he corrects Eck on the proper interpretation and application of Sirach 15. Now, this might sound familiar because earlier in this series, when we looked at the Acta Augustana, where Luther gives a corrective to what he perceived was the Pope's misinterpretation of Wisdom 7:14, here, after Leipzig, Luther is correcting Eck's interpretation of Sirach. Again, there's no dispute about Sirach's canonical status, much less that it can be adduced in proof. So, what do we make of this? Well, prior to Leipzig, like we saw, Luther's use fits perfectly with Augustinian canon view. He himself sets out that he deuces them in debates, they serve as proof. He even occasionally implicitly uses them as canonical text. He weaves deuterocanonical quotations seamlessly in his argument, never qualifying or distinguishing their authority from the proto-canonical quotations. He uses both, and he uses them both with the same kind of authoritative weight. Then after Leipzig, what we find is that Luther continues to use the Deuterocanon, specifically Wisdom and Sirach, in a manner contrary to both Jerome and the Jeromist position. Now, what's the Jerome position? What is the Jeromist position? Okay, so Jerome said that the Deuterocanon, those 7 Old Testament books that are accepted by Catholics and Orthodox today, that they are not canonical and therefore they're part of the Apocrypha, and that they cannot be used to confirm doctrine. They're only for edification. Okay, that's Jerome's position. The Jeromist position in the Middle Ages was somewhat different because the church had already spoken on these books and the church has affirmed the canonical status of the Deuterocanon. So the Jeromist, couldn't deny that they're part of the canon. So they admit the Deuterocanon is in the canon, but they sneak Jerome in and say, well, these are certain canonical books that cannot be used perfectly in authoritative debates. Okay, they can't be used to confirm doctrine. In other words, there are canonical books that can confirm doctrine and canonical books that can't. That's the Jeromist position. So at Leipzig, Luther flip-flops. He moves from the Augustin position, which is the same position affirmed in Trent, to amalgamation of Jerome and the Jeromist position, I guess you could say. For example, he adopts something like the strict Jeromist position, where he says that Jerome's opinion is even above the ecumenical councils, right? When he challenges Eck to first take out Jerome and then appeal to Florence. So that's more of a Jeromist position. But unlike the Jeromist, who considered these books canonical, Luther appeals to Jerome's position that they're not canonical. So it's a kind of strange in between position between the Jeromist and the Jerome position. If this is messing up and you're confused, don't worry about it. It's not super important. I'm just trying to nail down exactly where he stands in terms of what he says at the second Leipzig disputation. However, what we just saw now in this episode is that after Leipzig, in the disputes, Luther continues to use the Deuterocanonical text, specifically Wisdom and Sirach, in a manner completely contrary to Jerome, the Jeromist. He is totally Augustinian again. So this is a major flip-flop. From this, I think we can agree safely, and we can concur with Root, who has an unpublished article, who says, quote, in his theological work up to 1519, Luther appealed to various Old Testament controverted texts in the same way he appealed to other biblical texts, without any signs that such an appeal was problematic. A shift occurred in 1519 during the Leipzig disputation with Johann Eck, but Root stops his survey there. But we can say that after Leipzig, Luther now reverts back to that Tridentian understanding of these books, at least as far as how we can see and how he uses it. Or at least he reverts back to, if you're uncomfortable with that, he reverts back to how he used this book before Leipzig. So the shift from the Augustinian to the Jerome view, however, appears to apply only to Second Maccabees. I don't know how else to reconcile the two views. But the other deuterocanonical texts seem to emerge from Leipzig unscathed. In other words, Wisdom and Sirach, like we just seen, is being adduced in debate, serves as proof, perhaps even canonical proof, given his citation of Augustine. He's aware that Jerome did not accept these books as canonical. He's also aware that Jerome rejected the whole of the Deuterocanon, because as we saw in the last episode when we're looking at the second Leipzig disputation, he mentions that second Maccabees is rejected by Jerome, and he says, quote, some others of the Apocrypha as well. So he's well aware that Wisdom was rejected and Sirach was rejected by Jerome. Yet here we have, a month later and following, Wisdom and Sirach being adduced. So was the rejection only for second Maccabees? And if that's so, then he's even going beyond Jerome to something completely different. It appears, therefore, that Luther's main criteria for canonicity was not Jerome, but rather it was his own personal and subjective assessment of individual books' strength and virtue. Had Luther strictly followed Jerome in everything, he would have rejected the whole of the Deuterocanon. Now, H. Howarth, commenting on this appeal to Jerome, characterized it as being disingenuous special pleading. And there is a sense where that's true. It really is disingenuous special pleading. I mean, after all, if Jerome were his only criteria, then the idea that the church could not give a book an authority that it didn't already possess, if that's true for the church, how much more true would it be for St. Jerome, right? So in a sense, he's kind of making St. Jerome into a super pope. But like I said, I don't think that he's using this as his only criteria. Rather, he's also using, maybe primarily using, his own personal assessment and subjective assessment of the canonical weight of each individual book. So perhaps there's a better way to understand Luther's shift at Leipzig as being as follows. When Luther's views aligned with that of Jerome, as was in the case of Second Maccabees, Luther raised Jerome above all other authorities, even ecumenical councils. But when Luther's view ran counter to Jerome, which appears to be in the case of Wisdom and Sirach in these cases, then Luther ignores them. And I think that's the only way, at least I can make sense of the data of Luther's usage through this period in theological disputes. And I think that's true. I think that his primary criteria was whether or not he heard Christ in a book. And then, whenever Jerome agreed with his assessment, he appealed to Jerome. But when he didn't, he ignored him. Okay, now here's some confirmation to that because I'm not the only one to notice this. Andreas Karlstadt, Luther's companion, in fact, he was in the debate at Leipzig in the first debate when he debated Johann Eck on free will. And he was a companion with Luther, but he kind of broke off in certain areas because there's some things that Luther was doing that he didn't agree with. He wrote a book on the canon. In fact, I think this is like the first Reformation work specifically on the canon called De Canonicus Scripturis. And in this work, Karlstadt notes how Luther is not consistent in his appeal to Jerome, where Karlstadt is. But he's not saying this in regards to the Old Testament canon. He's talking about the New Testament Deuterocanon. Because as you know, Luther famously rejected the Epistle of James. And much to the consternation of Karlstadt, Luther didn't believe that we had sufficient grounds to believe that the Apostle James wrote the Epistle to James. And therefore, he thought that it should have inferior authority in the New Testament. And what Karlstadt does is he calls Luther on the carpet, so to speak, although he's very respectful of Martin Luther. And he basically accuses him of being inconsistent because Jerome never did that. Jerome did not do what Luther did in regards to the Epistle of James. So let's read from Karlstadt. He says, quote, "Why don't you emulate the same leader, that is Jerome, when he affirms that the same epistle of that man, Epistle of James, has fully deserved the dignity of authority through its use and antiquity? And when he says that it has been freed from suspicion of being apocryphal since antiquity, why are we so inclined to throw out authors whom our forefathers celebrated, both whom we can defend with many names, and whom finally we spurn only in title, and we dignify in other volumes under another guise? I admit that it is unclear that James is the writer of the epistle, but I do not concede that the authority is likewise obscure," unquote. So what's he saying? He's saying, Luther, look, you appealed to Jerome in terms of the canon, and I totally agree with that. But when it comes to the Epistle of James, Jerome didn't have any problem with accepting the full authority of this epistle, but you do. So Karlstadt realized that Luther was not being consistent when it came to his appeal to Jerome. And that's in regards to the New Testament Deuterocanon. But as we've seen, it's also not consistent with Luther's treatment of the Old Testament Deuterocanon. So when does Luther eventually become consistent and follow what Jerome says on the canon? Well, let's do a little epilogue, okay? Let's look at works afterwards. So although it really is beyond the scope, I mean, we've already demonstrated, we've exploded and dismantled John Calvin's claim that Trent had raised these books on Unseen Heights. Obviously, Martin Luther wasn't part of that party. He was using these books like everyone else pretty much in that time. He was thoroughly Augustine. But when does he become consistent? That's really a good question. It's important to note that Luther does eventually become consistent on this point. In the first edition of Luther's German translation of the Pentateuch, which was published in 1523, we have the table of contents And in the table of contents, Luther segregates the Deuterocanon of the Old Testament from the 24 Old Testament proto-canonical books, and he leaves them unnumbered. By the way, he does the same for the Deuterocanonical books in the New Testament too. So that's an indication that now he's being more uniform in his use of these books. 2 years later, in 1525, he pens The Bondage of the Will, where he responds to not Johann Eck, but Erasmus and Erasmus's view on free will. And again, Sirach comes up. Now, this shouldn't be surprising because Sirach was one of those Deuterocanonical books that the Anabaptists also appealed to mightily in favor of free will against the Protestant reformers. And in The Bondage of the Will, Luther says this, quote, and by the way, this comes from the Urstadt Pelikan 100-volume set, Luther's works. So this is a standard Lutheran translation. It says, although I could rightly reject this book, for the time being I accept it so as not to waste time by getting involved in a dispute about the books received in the Hebrew canon, unquote. So you can see here that in his reply, he's not going to enter into a dispute on Sirach, but he says he could. So apparently now here in 1525, Luther now has become consistent in terms of the book of Sirach. He doesn't admit it as canonical scripture to serve as proof. And he basically goes after Erasmus's interpretation. In his German Bible, 1535, Luther places all of Jerome's quote unquote Apocrypha into an appendix between the Old and the New Testaments with the warning, Apocrypha, these are books not held equal to the scriptures, but are useful and good to read. And then, by the way, the colophon at the end of this Apocrypha appendix indicates that at the end of the Apocrypha, that concludes the Old Testament. So Luther here denies the canonicity of those 7 Old Testament books, and he actually introduces like the Prayer of Manasseh in there as well. He denies that they're equal to Scripture, but they're still useful and good to read, but they're still authentic members of the Old Testament. And this is something that will take years before Protestants will get rid of the Apocrypha appendix, and they will never be included in the corpus of the Old Testament. So, some surprising revelations when we see Second Leipzig Disputation in context. But for the purpose of this string of videos that we watched, I think it conclusively proves that John Calvin is trying to pull a rabbit out of the hat, and that his statements about Trent and these books are completely out of whack. And Martin Luther, I think, is the primary source you could go to show that John Calvin doesn't know what he's talking about. All right, guys, I hope you like the video. If you did, please subscribe, like, leave some comments. That's very helpful. Also, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your support. It enables us to conduct further research and produce more videos like this. And also, by the way, the academic article is available on my Patreon site. If you give appropriate level of support, as a thank you, I give you this and well, other goodies as well. So until next time, I hope you have a great week. And this is Gary Michuta. Bye-bye.